Hello class. I'm a little later getting around to this than I expected to be today, but I'm just about to head home from campus and wanted to record some follow-up comments that we didn't get to uh, because of obvious interruptions to our class time together today. So anyway, just putting this slide up to remind you of what our objectives were for today. We're looking at both the Soviet Union and Japan and essentially how their experience, how we can characterize their experience in the decade or so leading up to World War II. And some very dramatic and different yet similar experiences that these two parts of the world will experience as they unknowingly are preparing for World War II. So we talked a little bit, I'll just show you this slide, but we'll move on from it. We talked about the Soviet Union, the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922, and how its early experience was characterized by power struggles and significant adversities, things like political differences, how to transition into a command economy, what the specific vision was, how do you adapt a largely urban industrial model for government to what is essentially and uh, a rural and agricultural society and economy. Stalin comes into play. He essentially emerges the victor of the political elbowing that takes place in the aftermath of Lenin's death in 1924, and he is going to be the face of what becomes of the Soviet Union's steps and critical steps toward becoming a global power during the 1920s and 30s. So we spent a little time, or I was setting the stage in class. I discussed a little bit about how a command economy under a communist political system uh, relies upon government decree to make its most important decisions about the economy, specifically uh, supply and which goods will be provided, and also distribution. In a market economy like ours, of course, we rely on price, and price is a very efficient incentive. People tend to provide things where they have reasonable basis for thinking they are in demand, and the price usually is adjusted to reflect um, the upper level of what people are willing to pay for it. So in our market system, in some ways, these decisions are much easier. But of course, a market system may stand in the way on some level of the vision that Stalin and other communists had about their hopes for the world. And so here we go. So the first five-year plan begins in 1928, and really the first two five-year plans, so from 1928 to 1937, the Soviet Union starts to show real uplift economically. I mean, uplift in a productivity sense. If you were a Soviet consumer, you may have felt a little differently. And if you were a Soviet citizen, you may have resented some of the ways in which this productivity took place. But essentially, we have, in the case of steel production, a quadrupling of the Soviet Union's ability to produce steel during the time of these early five-year plans. Their oil production at least doubles, and there's also quite a bit of agricultural productivity. And these are all important issues because Stalin has powerful global ambitions. He aims to be a global superpower and is mindful of his powerful counterparts in Europe and the powerful counterpart across the Pacific in the United States. And so he understands that heavy industry is part of what's going to make Russia strong. It's going to develop the infrastructure, allow it to develop industries and manufacturing centers, allow it to develop weapons. Essentially, steel becomes sort of the quiet or not so quiet backbone of the Soviet economy. But of course, in order to have large sectors of your population, your citizenry, actively producing in the manufacturing sector, they have to be fed. And so one of the most controversial decisions that Stalin undertakes in the early 1930s, this is while the world is gripped in uh, global economic depression, he endeavors to undertake his collectivization process. The term collectivization refers to the fact that Stalin is going to establish collective farms. In the 1930s in the Soviet Union, there were literally millions of small farms, privately owned, owned by relatively small scale peasantry. What Stalin decides is that this is no longer tolerable because the breadbasket region of the Soviet Union is the Ukraine, so today kind of the region southwest of Russia, fairly large country on the eastern edge of Europe. You've perhaps been following it in light of recent events there. And in the Ukraine there is a climate and soils and landscape that lends itself quite nicely to the cultivation of wheat. And this is where, essentially the breadbasket of the Soviet Union will come to be. Stalin decides that private peasant land ownership is not only consistent with a socialist system, it's inconsistent with that socialist system, but it also is, in his eyes, inefficient because the practices of some podunk peasants in the way they cultivate their lands is not going to be nearly as efficient, scientific, or innovative as the carefully practiced scientific, bureaucratic expertise of, say, government agents. And so he begins a plan whereby the millions of farms become the tens or hundreds of thousands of larger collective farms. The peasants are, for the most part, dispossessed of their individual plots and tasked with becoming agricultural laborers on these new collectives. So private property is literally being confiscated. Not surprisingly, this creates quite a bit of domestic unrest and upheaval, and as a result, Stalin determines that those people, and one group that was particularly vocal, were known as the kulaks. The kulaks were essentially the aristocrats in the Ukraine who had previously owned land. And Stalin finds many of the kulaks and uses them as an example. In some cases, he takes the leaders out and ships them to labor camps in Siberia. In other cases, he just refuses to, he just cuts off food from the Ukrainians themselves. He essentially harvests, has their wheat harvested, used to feed the masses back in the larger parts of the Soviet Union as a way of sending a message to the Ukrainians that when you don't tell Papa Joe or Joseph Stalin what he wants to hear, you suffer the consequences. And this is a fairly typical tactic of Stalin's approach to dealing with political opponents. All told, about 7 million people die in these essentially state-caused famines in the Ukraine. Famines because there's a loss of food, but the loss of food is a deliberate attempt by the Soviet power structure to deny political opponents their voice. This continues, and Stalin will remain a difficult and very intimidating personality. He applies some of this scorched earth thinking to even members of the Bolshevik party. You'll bear in mind the Bolsheviks were some of the more radical revolutionaries during the Russian Revolution. And even in the radical wing of the communists in the Soviet Union, Stalin's going to find ways to silence and sometimes eliminate, literally kill, destroy those political people, those people who disagree with him politically. And through these processes, he creates a tremendous amount of fear and secures power, secures control. In the short term, it's probably quite effective. But of course, it does not make him a esteemed or I guess he's well respected, but he is not, he doesn't endear himself to too many individuals around him. Also, he's going to undo a lot of those reforms that women under Lenin had experienced. So women are going to be pushed back toward a more traditional role within Soviet society. We talked about divorce, property, abortion. These kinds of freedoms are now going to be once again taken back from women. Okay, so on to Japan. Uh, Japan had a very difficult situation that it found itself in when the global economy started to turn down starting in 1929 with the crash of global markets. And particularly the challenge for Japan was its exports. Japan, as you know, is a very small country by landmass, and so it had relied upon, in its transition to an industrial economy, Japan's niche was manufacturing and completing goods and then selling them on the open market. The liquidity of money as a result of the downturn of markets, the ability of people to use their money and spend their money, of course, came to all but a screeching halt in the years after 1929. This left Japan in a very difficult place, and so her exports shrunk by 50%, and this created some real hardships for all sectors of the Japanese economy. The more modern government that had taken place within Japan in the decades prior was unable to come up with really meaningful changes. And the culmination of this was in 1932. Tsuyoshi, the Prime Minister of Japan, was assassinated. And he was assassinated by national extremists. And the national extremist element in Japan grew tremendously stronger as a result of the hardship brought on by the Great Depression. Essentially, these extremists argued that Japan needed to take a more forceful, demanding role within the global order, and it was out of that anger, that restlessness, that frustration, that lack of patience that Japan became more and more aggressive in the world order of that time. Asia is for Asians was part of a cry that many in Japan were making. They felt as though Japan should have a special role, that it should remove foreign influences from the Western Pacific. Asia should have a powerful role, kind of like the United States had established its Monroe Doctrine, which going back to 1823 had been a message to Europe that we are in control of this Western Hemisphere. If you need anything within the Western Hemisphere, come see us. That was kind of the idea behind the efforts put in force by Japan. Japan felt that it was an insult that European powers came and went and had such clout and control over large parts of Asia. And quite simply, Japan needed the resources that European countries were removing from Asia. And so essentially Japan wanted to become the quarterback of the Western Pacific realm, and it intended to do this largely with the help of its nationalist extremist realm. Just quickly, some events that are important. In 1931, an incident known as the Mukden incident took place in Manchuria. It served as a basis for Japan to establish a foothold on the Chinese mainland. In doing so, Japan alienated itself from the international community and the League of Nations. It soon withdrew from the League of Nations by popular outcry from the international community. Chiang Kai-shek, you might remember him. He was the leader of the Chinese nationalists. So China, to the south of Manchuria, is very concerned about Japan and its aggressive stance. Chiang Kai-shek decides that he has more to fear from the Soviet Union than he does from Japan. And so he allows Japan a presence in the north of China, and this is going to become a greater presence as he moves through. And I will stop here, and I'll just make a couple concluding comments tomorrow before we move on. Thank you.